Hi, everyone. Welcome. So the energy in the room is very high today because we have one of our favorite speakers, who's Mark Solms, who I'll introduce in a moment. And also, Mark is going to be giving a talk that some of us who were at the Berlin Congress had a preview of. And personally, I can tell you that when I listened to what Mark said, my hair was sort of going back like this. Ah! So I hope that you all have that same experience this morning, but don't feel too much pressure, Mark. So welcome to the Arnold Pfeffer Center for Neuropsychoanalysis. I'm Maggie Zellner. I'm the Executive Director of the Neuropsychoanalysis Foundation. We support the Pfeffer Center as well as do other activities. So when you guys signed in downstairs, that put you on the New York Psychoanalytic mailing list. If you also want to have your name on our separate Neuropsychoanalysis Foundation mailing list, we have a sign up right at the back of the room, and then you'll get announcements about additional activities. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mark Solms. And it really is a cliche to say that he doesn't need an introduction, especially for this audience, but I will go ahead and give an introduction for any of you who don't know really how impressive he is. So he is a professor and chair of neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town. That's his one of about maybe 1,000 pieces of his identity. He coined the term neuropsychoanalysis, was one of the very first people in the early 90s to start actively putting together brain constructs and psychoanalytic constructs. There were a few other people that were also starting to do that independently. He published a really groundbreaking book in 1997 called The Neuropsychology of Dreams, which was looking at the neural mechanisms of dreams in conjunction with what happens in brain damage to dreaming, and really looked at a very deep correlation between Freud's theory about dreams and what we knew already about the brain in dreams in the late 90s. And then he also published with his wife, Karen Kaplan-Solms. They published clinical studies in neuropsychoanalysis in 2000, and that was really a groundbreaking book. And even though neuroscience accelerates at an exponential rate, that book, even though it was now 11 years old, that book is still really worth reading because it's such a conceptually important book and really interesting. So that's highly recommended. Then he also co-authored with Oliver Turnbull, who's somewhere here in the audience, The Brain and the Inner World in 2002. That's been now published in 12 languages. And again, even though neuroscience proceeds apace, that is still, in my opinion, the best introduction to the brain for people who are interested in psychodynamic principles and the inner world of the mind. So if you haven't read that, you should get that. He's gotten a zillion awards. Two I'll highlight is that he was named International Psychiatrist. He got, the International Psychiatrist Award from the American Psychiatric Association. And then recently he got the Mary Sigourney Award for psychoanalysis. And if I just told you all of his awards, I'd be here all morning. And he's published over 350 articles and chapters in both neuroscience journals, very heavy-hitting neuroscience journals, and all of the top psychoanalytic journals. So just a couple of other things. Just on the side, he's been revising the entire standard edition of Sigmund Freud, as well as translating the entire corpus of Freud's neuroscientific works, and those will all be forthcoming. And then I just heard yesterday a whole list of current activities that he's involved with, and I'll just tell you that in the next year or so, we hope to see some really, really interesting findings coming out of his lab in Cape Town about dreaming and other aspects of brain damage. So not only have we heard a lot from Mark Solms already, we're going to be hearing a lot more from him in the next few years, and I think it's just going to keep getting more and more exciting. So without further ado, I give you Mark Solms. Thank you.
So many microphones, and I need space for my notes because this is such a complicated talk. I have notes. I wonder if we can put that one there. What do you think?
No one does anything.
many microphones does a man need?
It's very important.
Not going to be easy. Sorry, just got to make A4 sized space here. There. Okay. So thank you, Maggie Zellner, and thank you all of you for coming on this beautiful New York morning to the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. It turns out, I counted, today is the 159th meeting at this institute of our neuropsychoanalytical lecture series. So this is the 159th lecture. I didn't give them all. As Maggie said, what I'm going to say to you today arises from our 12th, as it was, International Neuropsychoanalysis Congress, which was held in Berlin in June on the topic of minding the body. At this Congress, papers were presented by Bud Craig, Antonio Damasio, Vittorio Galeazzi, Jaak Panksepp, and Manos Tsakiris, all of which, or in combination, raised some fundamental questions of great importance for our field. That's your phone, Gary. I can recognize his ringtone. He's got a ringtone which says, "Come on, Dad, pick up the phone." In my closing remarks at that Congress, I drew attention to these topics of such fundamental importance to us. And what I'm going to do today is restate what I said in Berlin, but also try to begin to think through some of the consequences for our basic psychoanalytical model of the mind that seem to be necessitated by recent developments in the neurosciences. I say I'm going to begin to think through some of the consequences because, in truth, I believe it's going to take us years to think through the consequences. Even in just these few months since June, as I've been myself trying to think through the consequences, I find it extremely confusing and difficult to get my mind around it all. Maybe it's just a matter of trying to teach an old dog new tricks, but I suspect it's more than that. I think it's something in the nature of the subject matter that we're dealing with. And it's that complexity that has made me have to write notes. I'll tell you something else. I made 57 slides for this talk. I don't think I've ever given a talk with more than 5 slides. And they're usually the same ones. Okay, so to start, here's an outline of my talk. And to begin with, I must say that there are 2 aspects of the body that are present in the organ of the mind, and they are represented differently there. The distinction between these 2 different aspects of the body is not always sufficiently clearly made in our literature, and I think this leads to considerable confusion. The first of these 2 aspects is what I'm going to call the external body for short. This is the somatotopic body image. By somatotopic, I mean literally a map of the body projected onto the surface of the brain in a point-to-point fashion. So this external body is a somatotopic map derived from the classical sensory receptors distributed over the surface of the body and projected onto the surface of the brain in the areas that are visible on the lateral surface in the slide that I'm showing you there. Here for example, here, for example, the retina are literally projected onto the occipital lobe. Same thing here for the organ of hearing, and same thing here for somatic sensation, which is divided into various submodalities. So remember, I'm going to call this the external body as we go along. Now, between these classical projection zones for the different exteroceptive sensory modalities, there's a convergence of the information arising from the surface of from the external surface of the body, and in this convergence zone, which we call association cortex, something which in classical behavioral neurology is called the body image is constructed. It's constructed out of a heteromodal conjoining of these different exteroceptive sensory projection zones. What's important to note is that this part of the brain, which represents our external body in the manner that I've just described, also represents in the same manner all external objects. The external body, as I'm calling it, is, in a word, an object. It's something that we perceive in the same sensory modalities, in the same form of consciousness, as the same sort of stuff as we perceive the whole of the rest of the external world. So, to think of it concretely as a kind of useful image, the external body is the body that you see in the mirror. My body, me. It's a thing. I should point out, as a sort of an aside, that the projection of this external body onto the surface of the brain doesn't concern only the sensory projection zones, but also the motor projection zone, the so-called motor homunculus. This again is a map of the body, a map in this case of the musculoskeletal or muscular body, which gives effect to our voluntary movements. All movements necessarily give rise to sensations. We call this kinesthesis. From muscle sense and joint sense, there's proprioceptive change as you make a movement, and so movement always gives rise to sensation. And the anatomical proximity of these two projection zones on the external surface of the brain reflects the fact that they are actually an integrated functional unit. So I'll come back to that later. It turns out to have more importance than we might have imagined. Okay, so much for the external body. The second aspect of the body is the internal milieu, which is represented deeper and lower in the brain. These brain structures monitor and regulate the vegetative or autonomic state of the body. I'll call this aspect of the body the internal body, for short. The brain mechanisms for this part of the body, or for this part of body representation, function largely automatically. But they also arouse the representation of the external body, that is to say, they arouse the forebrain, the higher structures of the brain, to serve the sensory motor body, the external body, to serve the vital needs of the internal body in the outside world. Notice that there's a sort of a hierarchical interdependence, therefore, between these two aspects of the body as they're represented in the brain. These two different aspects of the body each generate very different types of consciousness. I've said already that the external body, or the brain regions representing the external body, are associated with our classical sensory modalities of vision, hearing, somatic sensation, taste, and smell. I didn't mention taste and smell, but I'm telling you now. This interoceptive aspect of the brain, the aspect of the brain representing the internal and regulating the internal body, gives rise to states of consciousness. The sort of background awareness, if you will, the page upon which the objects of consciousness are written. I might mention here as an aside, the famous binding problem is apparently one way of solving the binding problem is in the way that I've just described to you. From the internal body is generated this background state of consciousness into which is embedded the objects arising from the analysis of the outside world with the exteroceptive sensory modalities. So the problem of how does it all come together is solved in this way, that it comes together in this background state which represents your body in the internal visceral sense of the word. States of the body as subject, which I'm opposing to the body as object. States of the body as subject involve not only levels of consciousness, like sleep versus waking, but also qualities of consciousness. Interoceptive consciousness is intrinsically affective, emotional. Affect is to interoception what the classical sensory modalities are to exteroception. We might say that affect is the modality of internal interoceptive perception. Affect is the modality by which we qualify our interoceptive states of awareness. The keynote of interoceptive consciousness is registered in the pleasure-unpleasure series, the generating of which is associated especially with the periaqueductal gray. The generating of such feelings is thought to be the biological function of consciousness. By attributing valence to our experience, by telling us which experiences are good, which feel good that is, and which feel bad, within a biological system of values, the pleasure-unpleasure feelings of this state of consciousness attribute valence to our experience. Tell us what is good and what is bad, biologically speaking. And on this prevalent recent theory, this is what consciousness is for. This is why consciousness evolved. It evolved in order to enable us to attribute valence, goodness and badness to our experiences. This, according to the theory that I'm going to be outlining today, is the very reason that consciousness developed. External perception need not intrinsically be conscious. And the evidence for this is all over the place. Perhaps the best known bit of evidence for it is the famous phenomenon of blind sight, in which it's possible to demonstrate that people who are cortically blind, due to damage to the visual projection zone that I showed you earlier, although they're unable to therefore experience visual consciousness, nevertheless do have vision. That is to say, visual information is transmitted to lower brain structures without conscious awareness attached to it. And they're still able to navigate spatially on the basis of this unconscious sense of vision. So on this theory, consciousness is added to, or is attached to, or colors external perception, and in this way attributes value to it. The motor aspect of the pleasure-unpleasure series is approach and avoidance behavior. Arising from the periaqueductal gray, the PAG, and ascending into the limbic forebrain are several instinctual motivational circuits. These are also known as the circuits for the basic emotions or basic affects. Many of you will be familiar with these basic affects, so I won't belabor the point, except to say that each one of these basic affects has a motor stereotype attached to it, which is necessary for survival and reproductive success. Examples are foraging behavior, or copulating behavior, or aggressive attack, or fearful freezing or fleeing, or nurturant grooming, or attaching to a maternal object, and so on. Each of these basic affects or instincts has attached to them a particular feeling state, a particular emotional feel. And this is a higher elaboration of what happens at the base, at the more basic level of periaqueductal brain. Feelings like fear or anger or separation distress, panic, and so on. These are basic instinctual emotions which are attached to these motor stereotypes and hardwired into the brain in these circuits for the basic emotions or basic instincts. There is a great chemical specificity to these basic emotion circuits or instinctual circuits, as indeed there is to all of the interoceptive structures marked on the screen at the moment. I suppose we could say that whereas the external body is represented with great somatotopic specificity, that is to say, spatial specificity, a mapping of one place onto another place in the brain, on the external surface of the brain. The internal body is represented with an equal degree of specificity, but it's not a spatial specificity, it's a chemical specificity. It has to do with more wave-like things, as you'll see as I continue to outline this picture. I will reiterate something I said a few minutes ago, which is that these basic affects or instincts are hardwired, unconditioned responses, as they call them in behavioral science. These are not things that we learn. These are things that we inherit, ways of feeling and ways of acting that are our phylogenetic inheritance. It's only secondarily that they give rise to associative learning in the process of early experience. So that's what I wanted to say under my first heading, namely that there are two aspects to the two aspects of the body which are present in the organ of the mind, and that these two aspects are represented differently. We move on now to the second aspect of my argument. It is in fact easy to recognize these two aspects of the body in Freudian metapsychology. The external body is represented in the ego, the internal body in the id. Freud himself said this. About the bodily origin of the ego, Freud wrote this: "The ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. If we wish to find an anatomical analogy for it, we can best identify it with the cortical homunculus of the anatomists, which stands on its head in the cortex, sticks up its heels, faces backwards, and as we know, has its speech area on the left-hand side." He elaborated in a footnote, that is, the ego is ultimately derived from bodily sensations, chiefly from those springing from the surface of the body. It may thus be regarded as a mental projection of the surface of the body, besides, as we have seen, representing the superficies of the mental apparatus. About the bodily origin of the id, Freud wrote this: "The id, cut off from the external world, has a world of perception of its own. It detects with extraordinary acuteness certain changes in its interior, especially oscillations in the tension of its instinctual needs, and these changes become conscious as feelings in the pleasure-unpleasure series. It's hard to say, to be sure, by what means and with the help of what sensory terminal organs these perceptions come about, but it is an established fact that self-perceptions, conesthetic feelings, and feelings of pleasure-unpleasure govern the passage of events in the id with despotic force. The id obeys the inexorable pleasure principle." Now I must point out that the word instinctual here is a mistranslation. Freud, fortunately, here defines what he means by the word, which in German is Trieb, which in the new Freud translation is translated into English as drive. A Trieb, an instinct, a drive, appears to us as a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body. Freud himself readily localized these two bodily derivations of the ego and the id. Freud never doubted that the mind was embodied. I have only added anatomical detail. We therefore easily recognize the functional equivalences between the brain mechanisms for exteroceptive representation and the bodily ego on the one hand, and between those for interoceptive drive and the id on the other. This applies also to the interdependent hierarchical relationship between the two systems that I described earlier. It applies even to what I said about the basic affects or instinctual circuits. Instinctual here being used in the proper sense of the word. Where Strachey translated instinct, he should have put drive. And what Freud conceptualizes under the heading of basic emotions is as we nowadays conceptualize basic emotions, that is, as instincts. Let me show you. This is exactly how Freud defined basic affects. This is Freud. And what is an affect in the dynamic sense? It is, in any case, something highly composite. An affect includes, in the first place, particular motor innervations or discharges, and secondly, certain feelings. The latter are of two kinds: perceptions of the motor actions that have occurred, and the direct feelings of pleasure and unpleasure, which, as we say, give the affect its keynote. But I do not think that with this enumeration we have arrived at the essence of an affect. We seem to see deeper in the case of some affects and to recognize that the core which holds the combination we have described together is the repetition of some particular significant experience. This experience could only be a very early impression of a very general nature, placed in the prehistory not of the individual, but of the species. In other words, inherited motor stereotypes which represent survival and reproductive success experiences of universal significance, which we don't acquire, but rather are born with. This was Freud's definition of what would be properly translated an instinct. Okay, so that's the end of the second chapter of what I wanted to say to you. The first chapter, there are two aspects of the body. The second chapter, as they're represented in the brain. The second chapter is these two aspects of bodily representation in the brain coincide with the Freudian conception of the origins of ego and id, no less. We move on to the third section. Precisely this parallelism between exteroceptive and interoceptive brain mechanisms on the one hand and ego and id on the other is what gives rise to the need for a radical revision of Freudian metapsychology. To begin with, or to begin to illustrate this, I need first of all to point out to you that Freud never questioned the classical assumption, the classical behavioral neurological assumption, that is, that consciousness was a cortical function. You may remember, this is why Freud thought that words were so important for cognition. Being derived from external perception and therefore capable of consciousness, it was possible to render mental processes, deeper mental processes, conscious by attaching words to them. And this attaching of consciousness was explicitly stated by Freud time and again to be a cortical function. And I mean time and again, believe me. Here Freud writes, it will be seen that there's nothing daringly new in these assumptions. We have merely adopted the views on localization held by cerebral anatomy, which locates the seat of consciousness in the cerebral cortex, the outermost enveloping layer of the central organ. I know, to his credit, Freud recognized that consciousness also entailed an interoceptive affective dimension. He even recognized that the interoceptive perception in pleasure-unpleasure series, was the original biological purpose of consciousness. That's why Damasio wrote this in our Neuropsychoanalysis journal. I believe we can say that Freud's insights on the nature of affect are consonant with the most advanced contemporary neuroscience views, by which, of course, he means his own. But for Freud, even this affective dimension of consciousness was an ego perception arising in what he called the superficies of the mind, its outermost superficial layer. He says, since, however, these sensations, and he's referring here to sensations of pleasure and unpleasure, since, however, these sensations, as we call them in contrast to conscious external perceptions, also emanate from the terminal organs, and since we regard all these as prolongations or offshoots of the cortical layer, we are still able to maintain the assertion made above. The assertion in question is, from the topographical point of view, becoming conscious is a phenomenon which takes place in the outermost cortex of the ego. I hope that point's clear. Even the feelings of pleasure, unpleasure for Freud were registered on the cortical surface. He thought of the cortical layer of the mind as being excitable from two directions. Affective consciousness, emotional consciousness for Freud, was generated on the inner surface of the system PCPTCS, perceptual consciousness, while the classical sensory modalities were generated on its outer surface. He initially assigned the system PCPT, or perception, what he had called in the project the system phi. He initially assigned that a location at the sensory end of the apparatus and the system conscious at the motor end of the apparatus. But from 1917 onwards, he combined them into an integrated system for perceptual consciousness. His reasoning seemed to be analogous to why movement and sensation are considered physiologically inseparable. Freud conceptualized the consciousness system at the motor end of the apparatus as the system that perceives the discharge from the interior of the apparatus in the pleasure-unpleasure series, or the lack of discharge in the pleasure-unpleasure series. So tensions build up, and then they're discharged and felt as pleasure-unpleasure. And this is the external sensory modalities coming from outside. He then, in the same way as we combine them here, as the motor discharge and the sensory perception of those movements on the cortex, Freud came up with this idea of a combined system perceptual consciousness which receives stimuli from the outside and the inside. The ones from the outside are our classical sensory perceptions, and the ones from the inside are our perceptions of pleasure and unpleasure. Again, all, please note, at the surface of the mind, the outermost cortical layer, as Freud himself described it. Anyway, that's the main point, that for Freud, consciousness of every kind was always and only cortical. And this leads to all sorts of contradictions, which I'm going to return to later. In making this assumption, Freud was following a long tradition, which continues to this day. Consider the following remark made again in our journal, Neuropsychoanalysis, by Joseph Ledoux. He says, when electrical stimuli applied to the amygdala of humans elicit feelings of fear, it's not because the amygdala feels fear, but instead because the various networks that the amygdala activates ultimately provide working memory with inputs which are labeled as fear. This is the readout theory of affective consciousness. The things that happen at the deeper subcortical and limbic levels are in themselves unconscious. It's only secondarily or tertiarily, once they've led on to all sorts of other things happening, that at the level of the frontal cortex, the outermost cortical layer of working memory, that we perceive, I feel fear, and we call it by a name, fear. This, as I say, is a long-standing tradition in behavioral neuroscience, and Freud, in locating consciousness in the cortex, including affective consciousness in the manner I've just described, was merely following in this tradition, not questioning this tradition. The latest incarnation of this tradition is the work of Bud Craig. He believes, as we heard in our Congress in Berlin, he believes that there is a primary cortical projection zone for the internal body. And this projection zone is in the cortex, in the posterior aspect of the insula. This posterior aspect of the insula, Bud Craig describes as the basis for self-consciousness, awareness of the self in the sense that I've been describing in relation to the internal body before. So that's the end of the third section of my talk, called the extraceptive fallacy. The basis for it being a fallacy is what I now move on to. Recent research demonstrates unequivocally that the corticocentric view of consciousness and self are wrong. Consider this interview with a patient in whom the insula was totally obliterated by herpes simplex encephalitis. According to Bud Craig's view, this patient should lack subjective selfhood. He should lack the very page upon which object experience is written. But this is not the case. The interviewer says to this patient who has absolutely no insula, "Do you have a sense of self?" And the patient says, "Yes, I do." The interviewer says, "What if I told you that you weren't here right now?" And the patient says, "I'd say you've gone blind and deaf." The interviewer says, "Do you think that other people can control your thoughts?" And the patient says, "No." The interviewer says, "And why do you think that's not possible?" The patient says, "You control your own mind, hopefully." The interviewer says, "What if I were to tell you that your mind is the mind of somebody else?" The patient says, "When was the transplant?" I mean, the brain transplant. The interviewer says, "What if I were to tell you that I know better than you know yourself?" The patient says, "I think you're wrong." The interviewer says, "What if I were to tell you that you are aware that I'm aware?" The patient said, "I would say you're right." The interviewer says, "You're aware that I'm aware?" The patient says, "I'm aware that you're aware that I'm aware." The point being, this patient has a sense of self and is conscious. But this only disproves Bud Craig's version of the corticocentric view of consciousness, including affective interoceptive consciousness. It only disproves the view that this aspect of consciousness is registered in the insula. What about the rest of the cortex? The most striking evidence relevant to this question to emerge in recent years concerns a condition called hydranencephaly. Hydranencephaly, as you can see from the scans up on the screen at the moment, is a condition in which the child is born with no cortex whatsoever. It's usually due to a cerebrovascular event in utero. As a result of this stroke in the womb, the higher part of the brain simply fails to develop at all. You might see here some little remnants of mesial cortex and of occipital cortex. So I better point out to you that these cortical remnants are utterly glyosed. They're completely non-functional. There is, not only for all intents and purposes, there is literally no cortex in these patients. So bearing in mind the view that the cortex is what generates our consciousness, including our affective, emotional consciousness, consider this interview with the patient in whom the insular... Oh, sorry, no, I'm reading the wrong thing. In view of that, consider this quote that I'm going to read you by Bjorn Merker. By Bjorn Merker, who, as you'll hear, has lots of experience with these patients. I know you can't read that, so I'm going to read it to you. That's a picture rather than a quote. Old dog again. My impression from the first-hand exposure to children with, when I say first-hand exposure, he had first-hand exposure to 1,200 cases. I mean, when I say cases, instances, not different patients. I can't remember how many patients that involved, but it was many. My impression from this first-hand exposure to children with hydranencephaly confirms the account given by Schumann and colleagues. He's just described what they say. These children are not only awake and often alert, but show responsiveness to their surroundings in the form of emotional or orienting reactions to environmental events. Most readily to sounds, but also to salient visual stimuli. The optic nerve is intact, which goes into the diencephalon. They express pleasure by smiling and laughter, and aversion by fussing, arching of the back and crying in many gradations, their faces being animated by these emotional states. A familiar adult can employ this responsiveness to build up play sequences, predictably progressing from smiling through giggling to laughter and great excitement on the part of the child. The children respond differentially to the voice of and initiatives of familiars and show preferences for certain situations and stimuli over others, such as a specific familiar toy, tune, or video program, and apparently can even come to expect their regular presence in the course of recurrent daily routines. Though behavior varies from child to child and over time in all these respects, some of these children may even take behavioral initiatives within the severe limitations of their motor disabilities, in the form of instrumental behaviors such as making noise by kicking trinkets hanging in a special frame constructed for the purpose, or activating favorite toys by switches, presumably based upon associative learning of the connection between actions and their effects. Such behaviors are accompanied by situationally appropriate signs of pleasure or excitement on the part of the child, indicating that they involve the kind of coherent interaction between environmental stimuli, motivational, emotional mechanisms, and bodily actions for which the mesodiencephalic system, that is the upper brainstem system that I showed you in the earlier slides, have evolved. The children are, moreover, subject to the seizures of absence epilepsy. Parents recognize these lapses of accessibility in their children, commenting on them in terms such as, "She's off talking with the angels." And parents have no trouble recognizing when their child is back. Episodes of absence in this form of epilepsy represent a basic affliction of consciousness. The fact that these children exhibit such episodes would seem to be a weighty piece of evidence regarding their conscious states. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold. There is in these cases severe degradation of the types of consciousness that are associated with or derived from the external body. By contrast, the background page of consciousness, the raw phenomenal self onto which object experience is written, is fully present. The body as subject is fundamentally intact. as is instinctual affect and motivation. The only intact ego function in these cases seems to be a rudimentary form of associative learning derived from unconscious perception impacting on their instincts. And this type of learning is implicit, unconscious in itself. So it seems all corticocentric theories of consciousness are wrong, Freud's included. But if consciousness is not cortical, then where is it generated? Well, we know the answer to that already. That's what I talked about at the beginning. We've known, in fact, since 1949, when Magoon and Maruzzi stimulated these structures in cats and recognized that basic states of consciousness, like wakefulness versus sleep, are regulated at that level of the brain, as are states of vigilance and arousal and so on. The basic levels, the state aspect of consciousness. 1949 already. After that, endless cases of lesions to those structures, marked on the left-hand side of the screen over here, have demonstrated the veracity of the view that consciousness is generated from these structures. When damage occurs in the structures colored on the image on the left of the screen, consciousness is obliterated entirely. This applies most particularly to the periaqueductal gray, which is the smallest area of brain tissue that needs to be lesioned to totally obliterate consciousness. We also have known from epilepsy studies, as I alluded to in the quote from Merker, that consciousness is generated in these upper brainstem regions. Penfield and Jaspers in 1954 already observed that seizures occurring cortically impair one little aspect of consciousness. It's only once they go down and cross the midline, once, in other words, they reach centroencephalic structures, what they call centroencephalic structures. Once the seizure activity comes down here, that consciousness is lost. So obliteration of consciousness occurs in seizures, not from cortical events, but from upper brainstem events. And this, as I hope is clear from what I'm saying, directly mirrors the lesion evidence. Lesions to these upper brainstem regions totally obliterate consciousness. Lesions to these higher cortical regions affect different qualities, vision or hearing, or somatic sensation, and so on, not consciousness itself. So note once again the hierarchical dependence. All that is new, this is old, all that is new is the realization by people like Panksepp, Jaak Panksepp, who spoke at our Congress, and also by Antonio Damasio, that conscious states generated by these upper brainstem structures are intrinsically affective or emotional and motivational. Based on all the evidence that this part of the brain also subserves the endogenous drive and innate motivational functions that Freud attributed to the id, we can come to no other conclusion. Consciousness is generated in the id. That means consciousness is generated in the part of the mind that is driven by our internal bodily need states that activates instinctual motivational behaviors that are innate, that are hardwired. The animal within, driven by the autonomic and endocrine body. Consciousness is generated in the part of the brain that subserves the functions of that level of the mind. We must also acknowledge that ego consciousness is derived from the id, not the other way around. This is fundamentally important because it turns the talking cure on its head. As I said earlier, for Freud, the value of words was their exteroceptive origin, their capacity to extend language with consciousness attached to them downwards and attach them to the deeply unconscious processes emanating from the id is what the talking cure was all about. Please note. All the evidence points in the opposite direction. exteroceptive perception sculpts, shapes, and constrains the endogenous consciousness emanating from the id. It is the ego, not the id, that is unconscious in itself. What then is the contribution of cortex? It generates representational images of external percepts. Unlike the fleeting wave-like affective states generated by the brainstem, these are relatively stable things, mental solids. Freud called them object presentations. Representations of the object world can be activated, the representations of the object world that are stored here, the areas that I was talking to you about earlier in relation to the external body. Representations of the object world of this kind can be activated both externally and internally. They subserve both perception and cognition, that is, cognition or recognition. Such processes are unconscious in themselves. It's only when they're engaged by upper brainstem consciousness that they come to mind. Freud called the engaging of object presentations by id, which I would now say by id consciousness. Freud called this type of object cathexis primary process. What renders objects conscious is their incentive salience, to use a modern term. Ultimately, their biological relevance in the pleasure-unpleasure series. Freud's paradigm for this process was the hallucinatory fulfillment of wishes. Responding passively like this to biological salient events or conjuring them up in our imagination, however, is not an efficient mode of cognition. Inhibitory constraints are therefore required. This occurs at the motor end of the apparatus, where voluntary actions must perforce be sequenced over time. Inhibition of action requires toleration of frustration, that is, an overriding of the pleasure principle. But more efficient and secure satisfaction of biological imperatives is achieved this way in the longer run. Freud called this secondary process, subserving the reality principle. The secondary process involves the binding of free drive energies. This creates a sort of reservoir of tonic energy. Carhart, Harris, and Friston, in a very recent paper in Brain, equated this reservoir with the default mode network. Be that as it may, bound energy subserves thinking. Freud noted that thinking is interposed between drives and action, and takes the form of a sort of virtual action, what he called experimental action, or trial action. Today we call this working memory. That is, doing things in imagination, holding things, like the objects of our wishes, in mind to guide action. This reveals the great value of mental solids. But it's important to remember that secondary processes also involve second-order representations, re-representations of objects and object relations at a more abstract level. Freud called these word presentations. Secondary process involves both word and object presentations, but words are vehicles for a more abstract type of thinking. It also renders thinking declarative, to use the modern term, and I'll return to this to you later. Secondary process, as I've said, serves the reality principle. Progressive internalization in memory of sensory motor models produces more efficient predictions. That is, less of what Carl Friston calls prediction errors or surprises. Prediction error or surprise increases salience, resulting in more affective consciousness. It'll be noted that this resulting in more consciousness is a bad thing. The whole trend of the cortical ego apparatus is toward increased predictability and automaticity, that is, reduced consciousness. One is almost reminded of Freud's infamous nirvana principle. This is the contribution of cortex. I move on to another thing that the cortex contributes. I've said before that external body representation is made of the same stuff as the representation of other objects. It represents me as an object. That is what the external body is, experienced like other objects in the subjective field of your background phenomenal state arising from the id. It's a stabilized representation of the subject, not the subject itself. I'm going to repeat that. The representation of the external body is a stabilized representation of the subject in subject consciousness. It's not the subject consciousness itself, which emanates from the id. I've said also that it's re-represented verbally as a concept, me or my body. This is the origin of the everyday illusion in secondary process perception and working memory that the exteroceptive body is the locus or owner of our consciousness. The raw phenomenal subject affects the external body representation in much the same way as a child projects itself into the animated figures it controls in computer games. These self-representations rapidly come to be treated by the child as if they really were the child itself. It's self, it's subject. I know this must sound counterintuitive, so let me give you some experimental evidence. Petkova and Erson in 2008 reported a series of what they called body swap experiments, in which a camera on the forehead of a mannequin, a false body, being projected into goggles on the head of the experimental subject, rapidly comes to create the illusion in the subject that this mannequin, this false robotic thing, is their body. They come to feel it as being my body. They even are, with these goggles, making them feel as if that they're projected into being this robotic mannequin false body. They even have such extraordinary experiences as going up and shaking their own hands and feeling that they are not the person that is themselves that they're seeing in the goggles, their real external body, but rather that they are this mannequin shaking the hand of that other thing, that other object, which is their body as seen as we see our bodies in the mirror. The objectivity of the illusion that this mannequin body is the own body is demonstrated by the fact that physiological fear responses in heart rate and galvanic skin response, for example, can be elicited in the subject by threatening the false body with a knife. So there's totally, just like that, they're happy to accept this thing is my external body. This illusion is similar to the rubber hand illusion described at our Berlin Congress by Manas Tsakiris. In the rubber hand illusion, your own real hand is screened from view, and a rubber hand is put over here, and then your hand and the rubber hand are stroked simultaneously, but you only see the rubber hand. And you rapidly come to feel as if the rubber hand is your hand. Very easy to do. Amazing. One's reminded of all the phantom limb phenomena, which I'm not going to go into all over again. These phenomena demonstrate that the bodily self of everyday experience is not something primary. It's an acquired representation, a memory image. All of this also places, incidentally, our theory of narcissism on an interesting new empirical footing. The anatomical basis of these phenomena is confirmed by fMRI studies in which bits can be experimentally added or subtracted from the cortical homunculi. Easily. And this, as I'll remind you, we've already acknowledged, is the locus of Freud's bodily ego. It comes and goes. Here today, gone tomorrow. The ephemeral nature of the sensory motor homunculi is demonstrated also by mirror neuron phenomena. Now, you all know what mirror neurons are. These are neurons which fire in the premotor cortex. Neurons which fire, neurons around here, there are also some other ones, but let's focus on these the most. classical ones. They fire when you perform a certain movement. The remarkable thing about the mirror neurons is that they also fire when somebody else that you're watching performs the same movement. In other words, from the point of view, if you will, of these neurons in the motor parts of your brain, exactly the same thing is happening if you are making a movement or somebody else is making a movement. It makes no difference which one of you is making the movement. How then do we come to know whether a movement is ours or belongs to this object called my body as opposed to that object called her body? How do we tell the difference? Well, according to some recent findings of Vittorio Gallesi, which were reported at our Congress in Berlin, the difference is in prefrontal cortex. In prefrontal cortex, additional inhibitory activity occurs, which makes the distinction. When it's not you that's making the movement, the prefrontal activity comes online, inhibiting, therefore, any output from the mirror neurons themselves. Interestingly, this differentiation doesn't happen in schizophrenic subjects. So the differentiation between self and other, at least in this respect, seems to be controlled by prefrontal lobe. This introduces a second important feature of the cortical mode of representation. Freud's concept of word presentations, which I've reminded you of already, does very similar theoretical work to what David Rosenthal's higher order thoughts do, or Ned Block's access consciousness, or what is generally known as secondary or reflexive consciousness. In the concrete primary process mode that I described earlier, there is no distinction between self and object representations. That's important. Second order re-representation enables the subject to differentiate between self and other objects to which it's relating. It can re-represent itself as me seeing something separate from myself. This me doing things is felt to be the agent of everyday experience. But it's really a re-representation of the subject in its primary phenomenal consciousness. The gap between the two, between the primary phenomenal consciousness emanating from the id and this re-represented object in our external perceptual space that we think of as me, the gap between the two is beautifully illustrated in the famous experiments of Benjamin Libet, which otherwise make no sense at all. Benjamin Libet's experiments, I'm sure most of you are familiar with those. He asked the experimental subjects to note on a large millisecond marked clock when they had the intention, the conscious free will intention to move a finger. And then he measured on their cortical surface of the supplementary motor area when the drive, the impetus from the underlying, presumably from the underlying dopaminergic systems which activate the cortical surface, he observed that there was a gap of nearly half a second between the subject thinking I'm making the experience now and the physiological evidence that they've in fact started to execute the movement. Libet interpreted this as to mean that you unconsciously decide to make the movement before you consciously decide to make the movement. Another way of interpreting it is that you consciously make the decision to make the movement before you re-represent it verbally in your second order cortex that tells you, now I've decided to make the movement. I think that makes more sense. This declarative self, generated by higher order re-representations, is also felt to be the agent of episodic memory in so-called extended consciousness and so on. This is very important for all sorts of things, but I'd like to remind you of only this. The whole trend of the secondary process is to reduce surprise, to increase predictability and automaticity, and thereby to decrease consciousness. This is reflected in the trend to transform declarative, explicit, episodic cognitions into non-declarative, implicit, associative cognitions. That is, to minimize the need for the active or affective presence of the id. I'm coming toward the end. If all this is correct, it has massive implications for Freudian metapsychology, including the metapsychology of the talking cure. I can't go into all of that here. I'm going to mention only some contradictions that have always puzzled me in Freudian metapsychology, which I think this revision as to the location of consciousness seems to resolve. You've seen this quote before, where Freud speaks about the passage of events in the id being governed by the pleasure principle with despotic force, etc. Now, how can the id be governed by or obey the pleasure principle if it's unconscious in itself? If the pleasure is generated at the perceptual surface of the ego? How can the id be governed by it? It's not possible, unless the ego is exerting some sort of top-down control over the id. And this is how the governing of the pleasure principle works, which is a nonsense. Is it not? If affective consciousness were generated cortically, the pleasure principle would entail top-down control of the id by the ego, which can't be correct. The primacy of the pleasure principle is therefore affirmed by our relocation of consciousness to the id. And also affirmed by doing this is the inhibitory nature of the ego's top-down influence on the id. Freud recognized in 1896 already, and here's the quote of him doing that recognizing, which I won't read you, that all the energy in the mind is generated endogenously. Psychical energies don't come through your eyeballs from the outside world. There is in fact no energy transfer from the outside world through external perception. Sensory perception doesn't involve the transferring of energies from outside into inside. Sensory perception doesn't literally transfer energy, rather it shapes the distribution of energy that is endogenously generated within the organ of the mind. Now, if that's so, why does consciousness, or why should consciousness arise at the sensory surface? It seems completely arbitrary. There's no energy transfer going on there. And on Freud's quantitative model, Freud's economic model, his energic model of consciousness, is that consciousness is generated, mental energy, psychical energy as he called it, by itself is not conscious. It's only when there are layers upon layers of it. He calls it pre-cathexis and then hypercathexis, and then bingo, you get consciousness. So Freud said there's first of all in the pre-conscious a binding of psychical energies that already raises the tension to a higher level, making it more likely to become conscious. And then there's a pre-cathexis of the perceptual system by this. And then there's a hypercathexis of the perceptual system by the attentional interest of the ego. And then, bing, it becomes conscious. So it's layers of psychical energy that make the consciousness. Now, if that were the case, isn't this where the great layers of psychical energy are going to be occurring in wave upon wave from the very font of psychical energy, accumulating here at the repression barrier? Wouldn't this be where you would expect the consciousness to occur if that theory, that quantitative economic theory of consciousness were to make any sense? Happily, by relocating, exactly as we do, consciousness down here to this level, it does make sense. This is also more consistent with Freud's view that affective or emotional consciousness was the primordial form of consciousness. This view implied that affect was extended upwards in phylogenetic, in evolution. I feel like this about that. That's the second thing to happen, the extending of it onto external perception. So perceptual consciousness had a purpose, as I described earlier, of attributing valence. So at least there's some coherence to that view. The view that consciousness occurs on the surface otherwise just seems entirely arbitrary, as indeed I think it is, since it was simply adopted as a convention from the behavioral neurology of his time. I've explained all that already. How perceptual representations attract consciousness by dint of their salience, their biological salience, their salience to the id, and how this fits with Freud's view that primary process entails hallucinatory wish fulfillment. I'm surprised that more commentators haven't noticed before that this concept of hallucinatory wish fulfillment implies that the unconscious is secondary, derivative, representational, hived off from primary wishful consciousness. Barry Oppertow seems to be the only one who's noticed that. The unconscious, in this sense, is synonymous with the repressed, not with the whole of the unconscious, the whole of the system unconscious. We now have to divide the system unconscious, or the id, into these two different things. The system unconscious in the sense of the id, the primary so-called unconscious, is in fact mega-conscious, affectively conscious, constrained by ego into little cognitive consciousnesses, which then get hived off, bits of them, into the repressed. These bits not allowed to be cathected by id consciousness. Hope that makes sense. What then does repression consist in? I've said already that the general tendency of the ego is to transform affect into cognition and then gradually render it automatic. That is, to render it non-declarative, implicit, associative. This removes the experiencing agent of the mind from ego processes. It seems then that repression consists in the removal of reflexive awareness. But in repression, this automatization, this deed, this making non-declarative, this rendering associative, this occurs prematurely, before the representation, the object representation in this representational material has in fact been mastered. So before you've got an algorithm, as it were, for dealing with this thing, which would automatically render it no longer needing consciousness because it's no longer biologically salient, no longer deserving of id interest. Before that occurs, it's whacked down into this automatic form. If it did that, there would be constant prediction errors, and therefore there'd be the constant threat that the repressed material would again attain affective salience and thereby regain reflexive awareness. And this lays the foundations for what Freud called a return of the repressed, the common mechanism of neurosis. Now here I wanted to have a quote which I couldn't get in time. This is Freud saying that affects can't become conscious, can't be unconscious, that there's no such thing as unconscious affect. It's Freud saying it there. What I've just said also makes sense of Freud's obscure but lifelong insistence that affects are always conscious, that one cannot speak of unconscious or repressed affects. On the view that I'm outlining now, affects are the underlying state of consciousness untransformed into cognition, which means affects will always be there in the background of our thinking. And to the extent that they are transformed into cognition and thereby rendered potentially unconscious, to that extent they are no longer affects. Lastly then, what is the mechanism of psychosis? We know that it too entails a two-step process, we know from Freud. First, a withdrawal of interest from the world, then a creation of a delusional reality which better satisfies the dictates of the id. And I see nothing in what I've outlined for you that would demand a revision of that view. I'd only point out that the psychotic state is one in which the patient is overwhelmed by affective consciousness, by excessive incentive salience, as Satish Kapoor recently put it, indeed. Also, through retreat from the secondary process, the psychotic patient also loses reflexive capacity to distinguish the own body from other objects, as I discussed earlier, and thereby loses the sense of agency and a lot more besides. Everything I've said, and this is the last bit, extends a thread that ran through Freud's own successive revisions of his metapsychology. The defining feature of that thread was that the executive pole of the mind, the major thing about the executive pole of the mind is not its capacity for consciousness, as Freud had originally mistakenly thought it was. in Freud's first metapsychology, the distinction was between a conscious system and then a preconscious, and beneath that, an unconscious system. Presence of consciousness in the executive pole of the mind was the defining feature of the executive pole. He gradually retreated from that view. And what I'm saying is that what I've presented for you today, the claim that in fact the ego is in itself unconscious, is an extension, in fact the final extension, of that retreat in Freud's own revisions of his model. What replaced consciousness for Freud as the defining feature of the executive ego was its inhibitory capacity, not its capacity for consciousness. Secondary process binding of primary process free energies, and with that constraining of the pleasure principle through the internalization of models of reality. This inhibitory capacity, this binding of free energies of this in the secondary process, became the defining feature of the ego. With the revision that I'm saying I think we have to make, we can reaffirm the centrality of this distinction between bound and free nervous energy, which Freud originally borrowed from Hermann von Helmholtz himself, and which remains remarkably current in modern computational neuroscience, thanks to the mathematical innovations of Richard Feynman in the decades following Freud's death. And now I would have had another slide of Freud saying that consciousness is the one beacon light in the darkness of depth psychology, but I couldn't get it made in time. We have also reintroduced consciousness as a core feature of the mental, even if in doing so we've had to turn Freud's first topographical model on its head. The id, the primordial essence of the mind, is conscious, while the ego, its external agent, strives to constrain and minimize this consciousness. More fundamental to the psychoanalytic Weltanschauung than the locus and extent of consciousness, however, is its fundamentally dynamic conception of the mind, coupled with the dimension of depth or hierarchy in the mind. These features of a dynamic and of a hierarchy are not only preserved in the revision that I've outlined for you, along with much else, but they're also actually strengthened. Considering the vistas now opening in behavioral neuroscience, where the primary affective instinctuality of the brain is being discovered by people like Panksepp and Damasio, this instinctive affectivity of the brain must of necessity be constrained by learning from experience. In light of this, it's difficult to imagine how the neuroscience of the future, the near future, can be anything but psychodynamic. If so, then Freud's models of the mental apparatus will surely provide first blueprints for the future. We are truly living in a golden age of neuroscience. As the cognitive neuroscience of the last half century is complemented and supplemented by an affective neuroscience in our own time, we are making the breakthrough into a truly mental neuroscience, in which we finally acknowledge that the brain is a subjective, sentient, intentional agent. I'll end not with a bang, but a whimper. Those of you who are psychoanalysts in the audience, I don't expect you to take the neuroscience I've summarized for you as a final court of appeal. I do, however, ask you to hold the model in mind that I've outlined for you today in doing your clinical work and seeing whether it doesn't perhaps make better sense of the clinical facts. That is our final court of appeal. Thank you very much.